John yearned for peace. City life had drained him, leaving him hollow and restless. He sought refuge in Ravenwood Forest, a place of towering pines and hushed stillness. His cabin, nestled deep within the woods, became his sanctuary. Days turned into weeks, filled with the scent of pine and the gentle rustling of leaves. John found solace in solitude, his anxieties fading with each passing sunset. In the tranquility of Ravenwood, he found a sense of peace he had almost forgotten. John set his book aside, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The tapping was faint but undeniable. He rose from his chair and cautiously approached the window. The fire crackled behind him, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. He peered into the darkness, his breath fogging the cold glass. At first, he saw nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the wind whistling through the trees. Then a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was just beyond the pool of light cast by the window, a fleeting glimpse of something dark and shapeless. John's heart pounded in his chest. He strained to see through the darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting rifle he kept mounted above the fireplace. The tapping stopped. "Hello?" John called out, his voice tight with apprehension. "Is anyone out there?" Only the wind answered, whipping his words away into the darkness. He took a tentative step forward, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The shadows from the trees seemed to stretch and twist, taking on menacing forms in his peripheral vision. He swung the rifle from side to side, his finger hovering near the trigger. As he moved further from the cabin, the light from the windows faded, plunging him deeper into darkness. The hair on the back of his neck prickled with an unnerving sensation, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. He stopped, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source of his unease. A twig snapped behind him. John whirled around, his rifle aimed at the sound. Deciding to return to the safety of his cabin, John felt a chill run down his spine. He turned back towards the faint glow of light in the distance, hoping it would guide him home. As he did, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a movement that seemed out of place. A dark figure, tall and slender, stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, almost blending with the night. It was difficult to make out any details, but John could sense its gaze upon him, cold and unwavering, like a predator watching its prey. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, heart pounding in his chest. The figure remained motionless, as still as a statue, yet John could feel a palpable aura of menace emanating from it, making the hairs on his neck stand up. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its silence more unnerving than any sound, as if it were waiting for something. John raised his rifle again, aiming it at the shadowy figure, his finger trembling on the trigger, unsure if he should shoot. The wind howled through the trees, carrying his words away into the night, leaving him alone with the figure and his fear. Panic surged through John's veins, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his fingers squeezing the trigger, feeling the cold metal against his skin. But at the last moment, he hesitated, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Something about the figure filled him with a strange sense of dread, a primal fear that transcended any logical thought, making his blood run cold. He couldn't bring himself to shoot, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The figure continued to approach, its movements fluid and unnatural like a predator stalking its prey. It was close enough now that John could make out some details, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. It appeared to be humanoid in shape, but its limbs were long and thin, its fingers tipped with what looked like razor-sharp claws, glinting menacingly. Its face was hidden in shadow, but John could sense its eyes upon him, burning into his soul, as if it could see his deepest fears. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He wanted to run, to scream, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by an invisible force. The figure stopped just a few feet away from him, its presence radiating an aura of ancient evil, a malevolence that seemed to seep into the very air around them. John's finger tightened on the trigger, but still, he couldn't bring himself to fire, paralyzed by a fear he couldn't comprehend. John retreated to his cabin, slamming the door shut and bolting it. He leaned against the rough wood, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. He had faced wild animals before, but this was different. This was something ancient, something evil. He paced the length of the cabin, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the windows sent shivers down his spine. He built up the fire, the crackling flames providing little comfort against the encroaching darkness. Sleep was impossible. He spent the night huddled in a chair, his rifle across his lap, his eyes darting to the windows, expecting to see the shadowy figure staring back at him. But the night passed without incident. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, John allowed himself a sliver of hope. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia, each moment stretching into an eternity of dread. John barely slept, his nerves stretched taut as piano wire, every creak and groan of the old cabin amplifying his anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold the promise of the creature's return, every creak of the cabin a harbinger of his doom. The nights were the worst, filled with the sounds of the forest that seemed to mock his fear. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, to convince himself it was a bear, a hallucination, anything but the terrifying truth that whispered in the back of his mind. His thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. But the scratches on his door, the lingering sense of dread, the feeling of unseen eyes upon him, all pointed to a terrifying reality. The evidence was undeniable, and it gnawed at his sanity. He considered leaving Ravenwood, seeking refuge in the normalcy of civilization, where the lights never dimmed and the shadows held no secrets. But something held him back, an invisible chain that kept him tethered to the cabin. A strange mix of fear and fascination, a morbid curiosity to understand the darkness that haunted him. He felt an inexplicable pull towards the unknown. He intensified his patrols around the cabin, his rifle always at the ready, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. He researched local lore, scouring dusty books and weathered journals for any mention of the creature he had encountered. The more he read, the deeper his obsession grew, each page a step further into the abyss. The knowledge, far from comforting him, only served to amplify his fear. He was trapped, hunted by a creature he could not understand, could not escape. The isolation that had once brought him peace now felt like a suffocating prison. As the days turned into weeks, John felt himself changing. The fear that gnawed at him began to twist into something darker, something colder. He found himself drawn to the shadows, his senses sharpening, his movements becoming more fluid, more predatory. He began to understand the creature, to empathize with its solitude, its hunger. He saw the forest through its eyes, a realm of shadows and secrets where survival depended on instinct and cunning. He realized that he was no longer the man who had sought solace in Ravenwood. He was becoming something else, something both terrifying and exhilarating. John, or rather, the creature that John had become, stepped out into the night. He moved with a grace and agility he had never possessed before, his senses attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest scent. He was the hunter now, the apex predator of Ravenwood. He no longer feared the darkness. He embraced it. He reveled in the thrill of the hunt, the surge of power that coursed through his veins as he stalked his prey. He became one with the shadows, his presence heralded by the rustling of leaves, the whisper of wind through the trees. The forest, once a place of peace and solace, was now his hunting ground. He roamed its depths, his senses alert for any sign of life, his hunger insatiable. He had become the very thing he had feared, the embodiment of the darkness that lurked at the heart of Ravenwood. Years passed, or perhaps it was decades. Time held no meaning for the creature that John had become. He ruled Ravenwood with an iron fist, his presence a constant source of terror for any who dared to trespass on his domain. He became a legend, whispered about in hushed tones by the townsfolk who lived on the fringes of the forest. They spoke of a creature of shadow and malice, a being of pure instinct and primal hunger. They called him the Watcher, and they feared him with a terror that bordered on reverence. He was a solitary creature, his only companions the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision. He had no need for others, his existence fueled by the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of his primal urges. And so, the cycle continued. The Watcher, once a man seeking solace, became the very thing he feared, trapped in a prison of his own making. He was both the hunter and the haunted, forever bound to the shadows of Ravenwood. His story served as a chilling reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most are the very things we are destined to become, that the darkness we seek to escape often resides within us, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And so, the Watcher watched and waited, his eternal vigilance a testament to the enduring power of fear and the transformative nature of the human psyche.